Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Mind Muscle Connection podcast. Today I have Greg Potter back on. This is going to be part 3 of our supplement series. So super excited to continue to dive into this. If you guys haven't yet, make sure you go back and listen to episode 294. That's where we did part 2. And then part 1 was episode 279. And so there's a lot of supplements that we've covered in this time. And so we're going to try to wrap it up. Like you said before, we could probably talk hours and hours on this, but we wanted to try to get the best ones out there and then as much information as you need to know on them. So Greg, welcome back on.
Thanks, Jeff. Part three potentially.
Yep. Maybe there'll be a part 4. You never know at some point. but yeah, no. First one that we wanted to talk about today, I guess real quick, Greg, before I dive into that, is there anything that maybe you want to touch on from the last couple episodes or anything like that? Or do you feel like you're just ready to dive into these next supplements?
The only thing I'll mention is something that came up when we were speaking before you pressed record, which is that there is considerable overlap between these categories. And so I know one of the categories you want to touch on today, for example, is sleep. And we spoke previously about ashwagandha, and there's quite a lot of research on ashwagandha for sleep, suggesting that it might aid sleep, maybe in part by reducing feelings of distress and physiological signatures of stress too. And so it's an example of a supplement that could arguably put into the muscle building bucket, the stress bucket, or the sleep bucket.
Yeah. And like I told you off air when you mentioned that too, is I feel like that kind of, if you do hear some overlap with some of these, that might be a good sign that it's a pretty solid supplement choice at that point. And I could also see that there's probably a good amount of, and we'll find out, but I could see there's probably some carryover from sleep supplements to like stress management supplements, right? I'm sure some of those probably go hand in hand as well there with that.
Definitely.
All right, let's dive into it. So first kind of topic we wanted to talk about today was fat loss supplements. So again, just to remind people, towards the end, we talked about like muscle building supplements. And so I think from a body composition standpoint, will be helpful to look at to go back and listen to that. But yeah, we'll start with fat loss supplements here. Anything that you want to hit on with this one?
Yeah, I think a lot of people are probably quite familiar with some of the more popular ones that are widely used in physique athletes or bodybuilding circles. And frankly, a lot of the non-pharmacological fat loss agents aren't particularly potent. But I do think there are a few that are worth highlighting. And there are one or two that are particularly interesting. One of the ones that isn't widely discussed at all, and there hasn't been much research on it. There has been a little bit of clinical research, and one of the studies is particularly interesting, is spinach tyhlakoids. I don't know if you've come across those before, Jeff.
No, I haven't.
They're membranes that are found in green plants, and this particular extract is typically dosed at 5 grams. And when people add 5 grams of it to a meal, they have stronger GLP-1 responses to the meal. And then in conjunction with those responses, they experience reduced hunger and subsequent food cravings too. And there was one relatively well-controlled, longish term study in which people who have PCOS took placebo or 5 grams a day of these thylakoids for 12 weeks. And they lost about 7 kilos on average, which is pretty impressive. They also lost about 8 centimeters off their waists. Most of the weight that they lost was fat mass rather than fat-free mass. And unsurprisingly, they had improvements in their insulin levels too, which is very relevant to PCOS. So that's one of these supplements that we clearly need more research on, but it is very interesting. And then in terms of the ones that people are likely more familiar with, we spoke briefly about curcumin previously, and I think in that section I might have mentioned ginger. I think ginger is a really easy win just because it's an inexpensive spice that you can pick up from your grocery store. It tastes good. It's easy to add it to meals. You can just consume it as a tea if you get ginger powder and you pour it into hot water and stir that. Or you can get fresh ginger and use that to make tea as well as dishes. And it seems to be good for all sorts of things, everything from gut health to potentially body composition too, and have been meta-analyses of both of those showing some modest positive effects. And tastes good, it's really practical. There aren't any real concerns with respect to contamination or anything like that. So I'd see that as being an easy win. And in terms of dosages, if you add something like 1 gram of ginger powder to hot water, have that as tea 3 times a day, that's probably right in the sweet spot of the amount that you'd want to consume. And I'll add that there's some interesting preliminary evidence suggesting that it might have some effects on various different processes that are related to biological aging. And it's plausible, at least in my mind, that might be one of the reasons that ginger can help with things like joint health too. And so I think in a resistance training population, it ticks many of the boxes that people would want to tick. Another one is capsaicin or capsinoids, these pungent compounds that you find in chilies, primarily, red peppers too. And these act through some similar pathways to ginger. They stimulate these transient receptor P vanilloid 1 receptors, TRPV1 receptors. And through that pathway, they seem to increase brown adipose tissue thermogenesis in people who have active brown adipose tissue, which is most relatively young, relatively lean people. There is probably a small number of people who don't have any brown adipose tissue whatsoever. I was reading a study recently looking at cold, and one of the participants, they couldn't find any brown adipose tissue in that person, even though this was a relatively young individual, which is intriguing. But for people like you and I, who are relatively lean in our 30s, let's say, we're likely to experience some modest benefits from consuming capsaicin or capsinoids. And again, I don't know if you need to supplement that per se. I think just using chili with meals from time to time, if you like the taste of it, is another simple thing that you can do, and it's going to be good for you in many different ways. And I'll add that I actually think that the effects of these pungent compounds on reducing inflammation are probably more potent than the effects on body composition. And inflammation is very important to various different aspects of health. So again, not something you need to supplement necessarily. You can supplement it if you don't like the taste of it, but I think just including it in your daily diet is a really smart move. And then also into this category of functional foods, we have coffee. And coffee is chemically quite complex. Certainly, there have been over 1,000 different compounds identified in coffee, and the relative proportions of these depend on all sorts of factors, such as the genetics of the crop. So, are we talking about Arabica coffee or Robusta coffee? The way that it's processed, is this washed coffee? Is this naturally processed coffee? What are the roasting conditions like? And all of these different factors, they're going to influence the chemical composition, which in turn affects things like taste and mouthfeel and so on too. But within coffee, there are a few substances that are particularly interesting. One of them obviously is caffeine. Caffeine is thermogenic and it does increase lipolysis. And so it's very relevant to body composition. It's probably one of the ways by which coffee might slightly reduce fat intake when consumed, body fat, when consumed on a regular basis. But there are also some other compounds, in particular the chlorogenic acids. And green coffee, which is coffee that hasn't been roasted, and true to its name, it's green in appearance and it tastes very different to coffee. It's nothing like as strong tasting, and it's also not as nice if you ever try it. But you can take green coffee extract or green coffee, and it will be relatively high in these chlorogenic acids, which have shown all sorts of different positive effects on health. And those include accelerating fat loss. That effect seems to relate to an increase in fat oxidation during the sleep period specifically, but green coffee intake can also do things such as reduce blood pressure. And then finally, there are lots of things in coffee that seem to be good for liver health too. So if you're someone who either has a family history of liver disease, if you're somebody who's accumulated a lot of hepatic fat over time, if you are currently taking anabolic androgenic steroids, or if you have a history of consuming lots of alcohol, basically all of those are going to contribute to some liver dysfunction. And in those instances, coffee intake seems to be really good for liver health. The most simple way for most people to go about this is probably just to consume 2 to 3 cups of high quality coffee a day. However, you can supplement chlorogenic acid specifically if you're trying to be very precise with respect to how you dose these individual compounds. So I'll pause there, Jeff, but
Yeah.
basically, it's a long way of saying that there are things that we consume on a regular basis in our diets that can positively affect body composition. And of the different things that I mentioned, I think the only one that might be relevant to supplementation is actually spinach tyhlakoids.
Okay, cool. Yeah, no, I have a couple questions on a few things here. With coffee, there was a couple things you mentioned that stood out to me. So first, high quality. I think you hit on this, but what would you consider high quality? Is that like something that you could get like a name brand from a store, or would that fall not, or would that not be under the quality?
Honestly, it's actually really difficult to say.
Okay.
And me saying high quality, that's not a very helpful comment. So I'll berate myself for that. But there are probably a few things to mention. So one of them is the genetics of the crop. So Arabica versus Robusta. Generally, if you go into a good coffee shop, let's say that you go into a specialty coffee shop, people will be serving Arabica coffee in those shops because it tends to taste the best. And the coffee snobs of the world, into which I put myself, tend to rate those coffees much more highly. There's actually a way of scoring the quality of coffees. It's called a cupping score. And without fail, all of the highest scoring coffees are Arabica coffees. However, interestingly, Robusta coffees are actually more resistant to things like pests. They're higher in general in some of the health promoting constituents of coffee too. And so there is a discrepancy between what people would perceive as being high quality coffee in terms of taste and what might be best for a person's health. But the other thing to mention is how the coffee is processed. And so my understanding is that washed coffees, and I won't go into the details of this, but washed coffees tend to be a little bit lower in certain problematic things that can accumulate during the processing of food. So you might have heard people talking about mycotoxins and things. And frankly, they're more or less a non-issue in countries such as the US and the UK. But there probably are some small differences between things like individual coffees in their contents of some of these potentially problematic substances. Washed coffees might be a little bit lower in those. And then in terms of the processing method, obviously the way that coffee is brewed has a dramatic effect on what's in the coffee. And so if you compare, for example, a regular 8-ounce instant coffee to a double espresso shot, then the 8-ounce instant coffee, that's what, 227 mils, whereas the double espresso shot is something like 70 mils. So even though the former is more than 3 times the volume of the latter, the double espresso shot is likely to contain about 3 times as much caffeine as the instant coffee. And the espresso method is also a very efficient way of extracting some of the health promoting chemicals in coffee, such as chlorogenic acids. Brew methods do matter too. And in terms of the strength of the brew methods, at one end of the spectrum, you have instant coffee. And then stronger than that per milliliter, you have something like a French press or a cafetiere. Stronger than that, you're getting into things like filter coffee. So that might be a V60 or a Chemex. Stronger than that, you're getting to an AeroPress. And then at the strongest end of the spectrum, you have the espresso method. And also the mocha, like a traditional Italian way of making coffee. But that's a long way of saying that there is a large range between these coffees and their different chemical constituents. And the stronger the coffee, the more concentrated the coffee tends to be in some of these health promoting factors, but also the more you're playing with fire with respect to the potential effects of caffeine on sleep, which is why, as a general rule of thumb, I think consuming 2 or 3 coffees a day, and while you need to find out what timing is best for you, probably finishing that final coffee by at least 9 hours before bed is a reasonable place to start for most people. And as I was getting at, 3 instant coffees might only be 150 milligrams of caffeine, whereas 3 Americanos, each containing 2 espresso shots, might be 450 milligrams of caffeine. There is a large difference between those. I think for most people, approaching 400 milligrams of caffeine per day doesn't really pose much of a problem if that is the dose that you consume on a regular basis and it's finished early enough in the day. But a lot of people do consume instant coffee. So again, I think 2 or 3 cups a day is likely to be fine. And if I was getting more specific still, I might say up to 3 cups of instant coffee, or up to 2, or maybe up to 4 cups of instant coffee, or up to, let's say, 2 cups of stronger coffees. And then if you want to go above that, just reach for decaffeinated coffee, which in the decaffeination process not only loses caffeine, it does lose modest amounts of some of the other health promoting compounds, but it's still the case that intake of decaffeinated coffee is positively associated with various different health related outcomes.
Awesome. Yeah, no, that's super helpful to understand that too, right? That not all cups of coffee are created equally, and figuring out what is going to be important there. And this was one of the questions I had too, was like too much, because somebody would hear, oh, this is great for fat burning, right? Or it's going to help with fat loss. And so it's all the more the better. And so I'm glad that you touched on, you do want to be careful with taking too much. Obviously, there's going to be other downsides of having too much caffeine as well, other than just sleep. But as far as the sleep aspect goes, I'm assuming you want people to look out for not only the timing of it, but also the overall dosage as well too. That could impact sleep as well too, right? The overall dosage that you have, like the more caffeine, I'm sure tends to negatively impact sleep, even if it's far away from sleep. Or is the timing the most important aspect there?
They're both important. And I find it a little bit difficult giving recommendations related to coffee intake, as you could probably tell, Ben, just because there's so much heterogeneity between these drinks. And even if you look, for instance, tea intake, then tea obviously contains caffeine as well. On average, 8-ounce cup of tea contains something like 40 milligrams of caffeine. And the amount of caffeine in green tea is quite similar to black tea. So bear that in mind if you consume regular caffeine containing tea as well. And then there's caffeine in dark chocolate and small amounts of milk chocolate too. Quite a lot in cocoa per gram. So you have to factor all of these things into the mix. And I'm guessing that people listening to this, being health conscious, some of them will probably consume quite a lot of dark chocolate. To give you an idea of the amount of caffeine in dark chocolate, there's typically something like 70 to 80 milligrams of caffeine per 100 grams of 70% dark chocolate. So roughly 2 cups of tea or 1.5 instant coffees. It's a substantial amount if you consume that much. And so you have to factor that into the equation too. And bear in mind that a lot of people will consume chocolate relatively late in the day, close to sleep, which could then affect their sleep. So you have to tally all of these individual items. There's a website named Caffeine Informer that contains caffeine contents of various different foods. It's not entirely up to date, but it is a helpful resource if you wanted to estimate your caffeine intake. And like you were saying, yes, dose and timing do matter. It's probably best to express dose relative to body weight. And I think on a regular basis, capping your intake at something like 4 milligrams of caffeine per kilogram of body weight. So if you were 80 kilos, Jeff, that'd be 320 milligrams of caffeine per day. And then as a, again, very generic starting point, finishing your final caffeine intake no later than 9 hours before when you're likely to fall asleep is a good place to start. The half-life of caffeine is about 5 to 6 hours on average. But going back to people who have liver issues, for some people, it can be over 24 hours.
Wow.
And those people need to therefore be very particular about their caffeine intake. But bear in mind that caffeine is a drug that people build tolerance to. And I think people historically have been a little bit overly neurotic about limiting their caffeine intake, and maybe a little bit evangelical when giving recommendations related to caffeine. There was a really nice study published a few years ago, and I might have mentioned this previously, but they took healthy young caffeine consuming adults and they had them consume 3 150 milligram doses of caffeine per day. So 450 milligrams of caffeine per day, which is a substantial amount. And the last of those was about halfway through the waking day. So roughly 8 hours before bed. And they did that for several days. And they used the gold standard way of assessing sleep, polysomnography, before they started consuming caffeine, and then after several days of caffeine intake. And looking at the electrophysiology, the patterns of brain waves the participants had, they were basically indistinguishable in the two conditions. And it's because of that habituation to the caffeine. So if you regularly consume caffeine and you like coffee, and yes, you do notice that when you don't have it, you're a bit tired, but you also don't feel like your sleep is terrible, then I'd say just carry on doing what you're doing. If you're not a regular caffeine consumer and you want to get some of the health benefits of consuming items such as coffee and cocoa, then you could try and go for that 4 milligrams per kilogram threshold, finished at least 9 hours before bedtime, as a place to start. And then if you wanted to come off caffeine for whatever reason, I would typically recommend tapering off as opposed to going cold turkey. Going cold turkey can work for some people, but if you've been consuming caffeine for a very long time, you'll probably find the first week, maybe 1 day to 1 week, quite rough. You might have quite bad headaches. You might be very lethargic. Ironically, your sleep might be quite poor too during that withdrawal phase. But rest assured that everything will normalize in due course. I just wouldn't coincide that period with a time when you need to be at your sharpest, because you might be a bit miserable.
So it sounds like with caffeine, it's one of those things where people overstate the potential issues with it. And it's all right if you do, like you habituate to it, and that's not necessarily a bad thing from what it sounds like. And if you enjoy it, so long as, again, it's not like super close to sleep and impacting your sleep, you should be in a good spot there. But if you do decide that you want to taper off of it, or if you want to go off of it, you should taper off of it versus just going cold turkey with it. Did I understand all that correctly?
Yeah. And as I mentioned, I think in a previous podcast, it is performance enhancing when dosed appropriately too. So take it early enough in the day, get it from good sources such as coffee and dark chocolate. And if you feel like your sleep is okay, then just don't worry about it.
Awesome. So a couple of questions I have on a few supplements, and I don't know if this one's maybe going to fall under a different category. It probably won't, but one that I've heard a lot of, and it helps more with, from my understanding, insulin and stuff like that, is Berberine. I know you're familiar with it, but what are your thoughts on that? Could that be used as something, or what are your experiences with that?
Yeah, I don't have any experiences with it. And I've also never recommended it to a client or anything like that. It's very potent. And when you look at how it's acting, Berberine more or less mimics metformin, which is a pharmaceutical drug that's used primarily to help regulate blood sugar control in people who have prediabetes or type 2 diabetes or PCOS. And so this is something that's very potent. And if you can take an appropriate dose of it from a pure source, then it can definitely benefit you when it's used intelligently. But one of the interesting phenomena that I've witnessed is that some people will use it preemptively to try and offset negative effects of quite disordered binge eating type behavior. I don't know if that's something that you've seen, Jeff, but I've heard lots of people do things like take a dose of Berberine around the time of a so-called cheat day. And I'm just not really pro cheat day or binge eating type behavior, full stop. I'd be quick to add that I definitely think that there's merit to so-called refeeds and intelligent use of being in a temporary state of energy excess. Let's say that you're trying to restore your muscle glycogen levels and you've been in an energy deficit for a sustained period, and some aspects of your endocrine system are temporarily in the tank. Maybe your thyroid function's a little bit sluggish. Your leptin is lower than you would like it to be. Your testosterone has dropped off the cliff. There is a time and place for type of behavior. And I also think that it's smart for people, say at bodybuilding stage, to initially regain weight relatively quickly to help restore their health, because they're often really in quite a bad place around the time they step on stage. But if you're someone who's just a recreational physique enthusiast or gym goer, and you are restricting your eating for several days each week, and then the weekend rolls around and YOLO, and you go to barbecue and you consume 8,000 calories worth of food, which is 4 times what you've been consuming the rest of the week per day, that is, and you take berberine because you think it's going to help out in that instance, I think you've got problems that you need to address. I think berberine, given its potency, is something that is probably best used with the oversight of a healthcare professional. And it's probably not something I would recommend to listeners of this show, just given its potency. And it is striking how similar it is to metformin in terms of the mechanisms by which it acts. And
as you were saying that, as I've learned more and more, like you said, there might be very particular situations where if you're like super lean and whatnot, where it's like, hey, you do probably want to get some weight on, but really in any circumstance, it's probably not a great idea to have a meal where you are consuming like that many calories. I just can't imagine that's great for long-term health or body composition, really in any way. And so even if you are trying to gain weight, is that you probably still want to avoid those really massive meals. And you mentioned people will have those massive meals and then they'll use like berberine. Is that where a lot of times they will put this in things like GDAs? They'll call them like glucose disposal agents, and then people will take that after large meals. Is that kind of the same concept there that you're talking about? Because I'm pretty sure some GDAs, again, people call those, I think, glucose disposal agents, and they'll market it for their supplement company. And I think some of them will have berberine in them, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. There are a few things to mention. Yes, you'd put it into that broad category. Anything that's trying to improve glycemic control and or insulin sensitivity, I think we can put them under the same umbrella. And there are other glucose disposal agents that you would consume on a regular basis by way of your diet too. So into that category, you can put things like cinnamon and chromium. And I'd be faster to recommend that people add a gram of Ceylon cinnamon to a meal, let's say to their oats in the morning, than to take a low dose of berberine. One of the reasons for that is, given that it acts similarly to metformin, we know that metformin can actually blunt some of the adaptations to regular exercise training. In some ways, it mimics some aspects of exercise. And given the way by which it affects the AMPK pathway, which is this master regulator of energy metabolism that's particularly important to doing things like stimulating mitochondrial biogenesis, and therefore is of great interest to endurance exercise enthusiasts, it seems plausible to me that if you took berberine on a regular basis while you were trying to, say, build or maintain muscle, it might actually interfere with your ability to do. And there has been research showing that taking metformin during resistance training does blunt adaptations to the training. So I would be quicker to recommend other ways of helping to improve glycemic control, such as paying attention to the sequence in which you consume foods at individual meals, starting with protein, fat, and fiber-rich items, and then ending meals with carbohydrate-rich items, to reduce blood sugar swings following the meal because glucose is going to appear at a slower rate in the bloodstream, then I would be to recommend taking something like berberine. Another way of doing this would be just to reallocate how you distribute your carbohydrate intake each day. If you were not training on a given day, it would make sense for you to consume the majority of your carbohydrate at the first meal or two, because we know from some very tightly controlled circadian biology research that blood sugar responses to meals and oral glucose tolerance specifically is substantially higher in the biological morning than the evening. It's about 17% higher. Another way of achieving a similar outcome would be to take a 15-minute walk after meals. We know that's going to reduce postprandial blood sugar responses. If you're trying to help with glucose disposal, there are all sorts of alternative ways of achieving that I would be much quicker to recommend than taking berberine.
Awesome. Do you maybe want to hit on real quick before we dive into the next topic? Is again, they'll just like with pre-workout, you'll see these kind of in glucose disposal agents. You'll see this umbrella term of like just a fat burner supplement, right? That companies will sell you. And are they going to typically have combination of these things in them? Is there anything special in any of these ever? Again, it's just like with the pre-workout. It's really going to probably depend on the individual product and what they put in there. And again, are they doing proprietary blends, stuff like that?
Yeah, some of them will contain proprietary blends, I'm sure. A lot of them will contain some sort of stimulant, which will typically be caffeine nowadays. It used to be ephedra or even ephedrine. And sometimes you might see things like yohimbine in them. And then otherwise, yes, some of them do include things like green coffee extract too. I think formulations have definitely got better over time. And also we see fewer proprietary blends now than we used to. But going back to our previous conversation, I would just personally rather choose individual ingredients, dose them at levels that I know to be effective and go about it that way. And given that these ingredients that I mentioned so far act through some somewhat distinct pathways, so spinach tyhlakoids versus green coffee extract versus ginger and capsaicin and capsinoids, there are reasons to think that combining them could be effective. But just going back to an earlier point that I made, I want to emphasize that the magnitude of effects that you're going to get from these is nothing like what you get from, say, taking a GLP-1 agonist like semaglutide or something like that.
Which I had that potentially on there, but that's not a supplement, right? That's obviously something that you would have to get through a doctor and whatnot like that. Cool. Anything else on the fat loss supplements? Or are you ready to move on to the next topic?
No, I think ready to move on. The one other comment that I'll add is that make sure your protein intake is high enough. If you look at research on weight loss diets, adequate protein intake is so important, both to the retention of fat-free mass, but also to helping with satiety and reducing total food intake each day. And the size of that effect might be larger than everything that I've just previously mentioned. We don't really know, but that's really important to have in place first and foremost.
No, I'm glad you brought that up, because that is, like you said, it's super important from the body composition standpoint, but also just like you said, consuming enough protein can be a great thing to help with satiety right then and there, and you don't have to buy any supplement for that. No, I'm glad you brought that up. Cool. So next topic we were going to chat about was sleep supplements. Anything there? Yeah, your top ones, and yeah.
Yeah. I think my favorite, if that is the right word to use, I don't think it is, one that's not that widely discussed, but it is really interesting. It's relatively expensive, and that rules it out for a lot of people. But the research that's been done so far on tart cherry juice is really interesting. And it probably affects sleep in a few different ways, but it's thought that the main mechanism by which it affects sleep is its melatonin content. Since 1995, I think we've known that various different plants contain melatonin. It's relatively ubiquitous in the plant kingdom, and tart cherries are quite rich in it. They're not the most rich. Interestingly, I think pistachios contain the most melatonin per gram of any plant that's been studied that I've seen, but they haven't been studied in relation to sleep. But we do know, based on multiple studies, that regularly consuming tart cherry juice can slightly increase sleep duration and improve sleep efficiency too. So the proportion of time that you're in bed that you're actually asleep. But one of the reasons that I like tart cherry juice is it's been shown to boost performance in certain types of exercise, endurance exercise specifically, but probably more relevant to a lot of people listening to this. It's also been shown to accelerate recovery from various different types of damaging exercise. So think of anything that induces exercise, induce muscle damage. That might be running downhill, but it might also be lifting weights. And there was a meta-analysis published on this by Glyn Howatson and his colleagues not too long ago. And they found that when you look at the size of the effect of tart cherry juice intake on various different indices of recovery, they're quite large. And the size of the effect on recovery of vertical jump height specifically was large, but the size of the effect on recovery of strength and muscle power was moderate. And that is also true of muscle soreness. It was slightly smaller for muscle soreness, but basically, probably in part by improving sleep, but also through some antioxidant effects, this seems to accelerate recovery from exercise. So if you were in a very hard training period and you didn't mind splashing out a bit of additional cash on something to help you sleep and to speed your recovery from exercise, this might be quite a good option. We don't really know how it affects adaptation to resistance training in the long term. I haven't seen any research on that. I haven't searched for it recently, but historically I haven't. But I don't think that it would negatively affect it, especially given the positive effects on sleep. And it's also worth mentioning that it seems to be really good for various different measures of overall health too, everything from antioxidant status to vascular function.
Yeah, Tart, that's one that I've taken before. I love it. Like you said, though, it can be pretty pricey. I know like a jar of it is it's expensive and it can add up and it doesn't last long. My question on that, is there any way to consume that without calories? Because I think the biggest thing there is it's, at least the ones I found have always are going to have 20 to 30 grams of carbohydrates and sugar. And then is there any way that you can supplement just that without it, or is that not doable?
Yeah. So the way that it's commonly dosed in research is 30 milliliters of tart cherry juice concentrate. Specifically, there's a product named Cherry Active that's been particularly well studied. Twice a day, once is often early in the day, say pre-exercise, and the other dose is often an hour or so before bed. And the total carbohydrate and energy content of those is not particularly high, but I understand why people would want to have a non-caloric version of it. And I don't recall the name of the specific product, but I know that there are now powdered tart cherry extracts that have also been used in an attempt to help people sleep. So I can't recommend these, and I also don't recall the names of them, but I know that they are out there. It's just worth digging around to see if the particular product that you find is one that has any clinical research on it just yet.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, you go for it.
I was just going to say, so 30 milliliters of tart cherry concentrate. Again, making sure that it has that, and it's tart cherry concentrate is going to be that kind of dosage there that you're going to look for at that point. And then twice a day, you said. And then is it like melatonin? Like if you were to take melatonin and it's okay, you take it and then you're gonna feel tired, ready to go to sleep, or is it like you can take? You said twice a day, so I'd imagine these people are taking. I think you said around the workout. So is the timing important here with that, or?
Yeah, it's a good question. We don't know.
Okay.
We don't know, and the timing of melatonin certainly is important. And if the melatonin concentration of it is sufficient, then you would expect it to be important. But given that people are taking it pre-workout, it can't be that soporific or somnogenic, because otherwise people would be turning up at the gym and starting to feel drowsy, and that's clearly not the case. But also that raises some interesting questions. So for example, if it is like melatonin, because it contains melatonin, then is it something that you can take to shift the timing of your body's clock, say during jet lag? And I know that in countries where you can't get melatonin over the counter, such as the UK, some people try and use it to help with jet lag. But again, I don't think it's been studied in that context. And then the other thing that I'll add is that there are lots of these plants that contain melatonin, and some of them have been studied too. So there's a bit of research looking at so-called beefsteak tomatoes. And there was some work showing that people consuming 250 grams per day of these beefsteak tomatoes improved their sleep. it's an instance in which people have studied tart cherries, but it's probably the case that there are several different fruits and vegetables that positively affect sleep. The other one that's been studied directly is kiwi fruits. People have looked at consuming 2 kiwi fruits at the end of the day and the effects of that on sleep, finding quite substantial effects on sleep. You probably don't need to go and get some special expensive product to realize some of these benefits. It's just that we actually know what this is doing. And there are also expectation effects that come with that. When there's research showing positive effects and people anticipate those, then they're more likely to experience positive effects on their sleep. But if someone didn't want to go out and spend that money, I would just say that we know that consuming some tomatoes and a couple of kiwi fruits a day is probably also good for your sleep.
Awesome. Any other sleep supplements that you think are important or that you like to recommend?
Yeah, we can speak about melatonin if you like, but just to add another one in the mix that doesn't really get any airtime that is very interesting is saffron. And there's a particular saffron extract named Saffron that is standardized for its active ingredients. So specifically, it's 3.5% leptocrosolide. This is a saffron extract. The dose that's used is 28 milligrams, often split into 2 14 milligram doses. Some people take it just as 14 milligrams, but 28 milligrams seems to be the sweet spot. And you can just take that either with your final meal of the day or maybe 1 hour before bed. I'd probably take it an hour before bed. And there have been several studies of this now. And as a result, there was a meta-analysis published last year, and they found quite impressive effects of this on sleep. So specifically, there's a standardized way of looking at sleep quality, the Pittsburgh Sleep Quality Index. It's just a questionnaire. You can find it online if you're curious. And it's scored such that the higher the score, the worse the sleep. And they found that if you look across these different studies of people taking saffron, on average, they have a PSQI score of just over 2 points lower after taking saffron. And again, there's another of these questionnaire scales that's widely used. It's called the Insomnia Severity Index. And this found that their insomnia score was reduced by about 2.6 points after taking saffron on a regular basis. It's very well tolerated. It seems to be good for some aspects of cardiometabolic health too. So specifically, possibly adiposity. So going back to the fat loss conversation, it seems that a bunch of things that can improve sleep can in turn improve body composition, unsurprisingly. Also, maybe fasting glucose. Again, maybe some of that is mediated by the effects on sleep, but particularly interesting for a lot of people, given the prevalence of various different mental health disorders nowadays. Saffron seems to have quite potent effects on mood. And there's been some work looking at people taking it who experience depression, suggesting that it can improve mood in those people. So if you have this shared phenotype of relatively low mood, poor sleep, and you want to improve your body composition, it's a really good candidate for you. And it's something that I would speak to your medical doctor about if you were, say, taking medications for depression or anything like that. But the type of person or the type of profile that I just described is very common nowadays. There are so many people out there whose mood is a bit lower than they would like it to be. Maybe they don't reach the diagnostic criteria for depression. They've got this kind of subclinical depressive tendency, and that's accompanied by poor sleep. This is probably a really good choice for those people.
I've actually never heard of that. Super interesting. I just did a quick search while you were talking about it. And yeah, it says all those things you mentioned. One of them too is even libido and sexual function as well too, potentially. Now, is that from better sleep? Is that from low, like better mood? Who knows on that? But yeah, interesting. Now with that, is it powder form, pill form? Can you find it in food or?
Yeah, you could get it from saffron, but saffron is really expensive. And this might be something where the dose is important because we're talking about quite a small quantity of it. And because we're talking about a small quantity of it, the supplements also aren't that expensive. I, in the UK, have tried it a couple of times. The company that I've used is called Mind Nutrition, just in case anyone's tuning in from the UK and wants to try it. I really like their products. They make single ingredient products for the most part, which tend to use patented extracts of the ingredients of interest. And it's not that expensive. It really isn't. You just take a couple of pills of it, 2 times 14 milligrams pills, an hour before bed. And I would do that rather than taking saffron, just given the doses that we're talking about. And also given that, whereas I think things like chili, cinnamon, and ginger are things that a lot of people consume on a regular basis, particularly if they consume certain types of cuisine. Lots of Southeast Asian cuisines, for instance, are very rich in those spices. Saffron, it's probably a bit less true of.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah. So I see. So you can get it. It's like something that you can add into food and things like that there on it. Cool. A couple other ones that I wanted to bring up to you just to hear your thoughts on them were, and again, I'm going to just say both of them. So one's glycine and the other one is Rutaecarpine, I believe. And my understanding from Rutaecarpine is it eliminates caffeine from the body. So I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on those two.
Yeah. I haven't seen any good clinical research showing that Rutaecarpine does that.
Okay.
And occasionally you get these ingredients that come up and people make big claims related to them. But I've never seen any actual clinical research showing that to be the case. I'll have to check after this if there is any. If there's any that I'm not aware of. There might be. But if there is, then there certainly isn't much of it. There's also a question about whether you actually want to eliminate caffeine from your body. Fair enough if you've just been to a coffee festival and you've consumed about 20 coffees in a day. I actually had that experience. That's awesome. A couple of months ago in London. I consumed a truly heroic dose of coffee. I probably had 1.5 grams of caffeine in a day. The thing is, I set a new PB that day, and if Rutaecarpine works, then I definitely needed it. But I don't think people should really worry about that.
Okay.
And then glycine is very interesting. Frankly, the research on the effects of glycine on sleep is pretty poor. There's one of these supplements where it gets lots of attention and people speak about it as if it's clearly a home run. And there's been loads of rigorous clinical research on it. There just hasn't. There has been a little bit published in some quite obscure journals using small sample sizes and so on. The research done to date suggests that taking 3 grams at the end of the day might slightly improve sleep. The effects probably aren't particularly big. Some of those effects seem to be mediated by effects on the melatonin pathway and core body temperature, maybe suprachiasmatic nucleus function too. That's the master clock in the brain that's particularly important to helping to set various different circadian rhythms in your body. But that's going by preclinical research. But the reason that I actually like glycine anyway is that it does seem to have a variety of different positive effects on health. There is work showing, for instance, that it might modestly improve things like blood sugar control. And the most interesting work on glycine to me is some recent work looking at it in the context of aging. And glycine is a precursor for glutathione. And what is that if you look at glutathione levels in people across the lifespan, they dwindle as people age. And given that glutathione is the most abundant antioxidant in the body, it's the so-called master antioxidant, that seems to have all sorts of knock-on effects, everything from mitochondrial function to so-called inflammaging. And there's been some really interesting research in the last 3 years looking at combining high-dose glycine. We're talking about something like 0.1 grams of glycine per kilo. So if you're 80 kilos, that would be 8 grams of glycine with very high dose N-acetylcysteine, because cysteine is another one of these precursors for glutathione. And again, the dose of that used is 0.1 grams of N-acetylcysteine per kilo of body weight. So we're talking about 8 grams of NAC and 8 grams of glycine. But when adults past the age of 60 or so take those in conjunction with each other every day for a few months, they have these incredibly impressive responses across various different bodily systems. So the research done so far, while limited to a few studies, has shown that particular approach dramatically increases glutathione levels to the point where they're more or less the same as healthy young adults, improves various different markers of mitochondrial function, improves the state of other antioxidants, so things like T-bars and MDA, improves physical performance. So they look at things like how quickly people walk and grip strength, and improves some aspects of cognition too. And so if you look at the aging research, geroscience, research into anti-aging longevity, people have identified these so-called hallmarks of aging. There are at least 9 of them that have been identified so far. And this glycine plus NAC combo, which has been dubbed GlyNAC, seems to target a lot of them. So that is the application of glycine that I think is most interesting. For people like you and I, Jeff, I don't think we would experience much benefit from that approach, if any, because our glutathione state is probably fine at our age. But if I was 60 years old right now, I would be taking that for several months of the year, for sure, because I don't see much downside. For you and I, would I take glycine? I have done before, and I've never noticed anything at all, apart from the fact that it tastes quite nice. It tastes a little bit like sugar. It's not quite sweet per gram, but it's quite similar. So a lot of people will just take it and they'll pop it in some sort of hot drink, and that's fine. And it's also a precursor for connective tissue, and that's one of the reasons that people are interested in taking it for warding off aging too, because that might be relevant to things like skin health and so on. But going back to a previous conversation, I would just take collagen as a supplement. So it's a long way of saying that glycine is really interesting. The effects on sleep, based on what we know so far, are probably quite small, but the application of glycine, I think, is by far the most promising, is combining it with NAC at high doses in people who are 60 years or older.
Cool. Yeah. So again, sleep, not too sure on as for right now, but again, like you said, older people combining it with NAC is where you see a really good application there. Cool. We're coming to the end of the time here. We still have a couple top or categories that we want to get through, but I did want to go over sleep real quick. Is there anything else from a sleep standpoint that you think is important or anything like that?
I'm gonna collapse 2 categories together now, Jeff, just given that we're going to collapse the sleep and the stress one.
Okay.
And the supplement that percolates to the surface here is L-theanine, most abundant amino acid in tea. There's a standardized form of it named sun-theanine. The dose that you would use is 200 to 400 milligrams a day, taken as 1 or 2 doses. I would just take 1 dose of 200 milligrams an hour before bed. Tastes mild. You can get it as a powder if you want to buy it as a powder and save some cash, or you can just take it as capsules. You probably wouldn't consume it by way of tea, just given that tea also contains caffeine. It wouldn't really make sense. But L-theanine seems to be helpful for a few different things. It is weakly anxiolytic, slightly reduced anxiety. It consistently reduces people's perceptions of distress, so how stressed they feel, as well as some of their physiological stress responses. And people have looked at things like cortisol levels in saliva and changes in heart rate and cardiovascular indices such as blood pressure. The size of the effects isn't huge, but they are there consistently. It also pairs very well with caffeine if people are interested in using it as a nootropic. And the reason I mention that is that some people feel a little bit jittery when they consume caffeine, and you could just take 200 milligrams of L-theanine at the same time. And that is a nice combination in many ways. But if you look at the effects of L-theanine in isolation, then it does slightly improve the ability to pay attention during certain tasks. So it's good for cognition acutely. It's not something that just knocks you out. It just helps reduce how stressed you feel and thereby improves your sleep. Fantastic safety profile, inexpensive, pretty easy win, really. I would just take 200 milligrams an hour before bed.
But you said you could also combine it with caffeine as well, too. And I was going to ask you that because I feel like I have seen that in certain pre-workout supplements and things like that is L-theanine.
Yeah, absolutely. You could do. And if you wanted to do it that way, I would take 200 milligrams with your caffeine at the start of the day. So let's say that you had 3 coffees and you're feeling a little bit jittery. You could take 200 milligrams of L-theanine at the same time. You'd probably feel a little bit better. And then take 200 milligrams at the end of the day. That way, you're staying in that 200 to 400 milligrams dose per day, and you're getting some of the cognitive benefits early in the day, and some of the sleep benefits later in the day.
I like that because, yeah, I think one of the downsides with caffeine, too much caffeine, is that jitteriness and higher levels of anxiety. So it's like you're almost getting the benefits of the caffeine, but then by taking that too, it wipes out the potential downsides of caffeine as well too. Cool. No, I love that one. Anything else that you would combine? We talked about before too that there's probably going to be some things that you can combine here with stress and sleep, because if you can work on stress, that's going to help sleep and vice versa there. And so obviously ashwagandha, which we talked about in the first episode, and same thing with melatonin, we talked about that. Anything else that you would add to either one of these?
Not really. That, like you say, there are some potentially additive supplements. Some people think there might be some synergistic ones, and lemon balm and valerian come to mind, but I'm just not particularly persuaded by the research on those. And there are loads of these purportedly sleep promoting supplements that we could talk about, but the ones that we mentioned so far, in addition to smart use of melatonin, are the ones that I would tend to recommend. We've already spoken previously about magnesium, and I've already mentioned also that there are rare instances in which things like iron can be really helpful for sleep if somebody has certain sleep disorders. But for the most part, the ones that we just mentioned, I think are helpful for the types of sleep difficulties experienced by many people.
Well, and into a lot of these supplements that we've gone over too, I feel like we've done a good job of picking ones that, again, there's probably certain things that we could like for sleep. We could sit here and dive in and dive super deep. Hey, this may do this and you could take this, but it's like, these are going to be good, safe bets that most people could benefit from. Obviously, you've given your kind of, hey, if you have this, you don't want to, but overall, I feel like all the supplements we've gone over are pretty safe bet and the low hanging fruit type supplement for most people there and whatnot. If you have time, is there anything that was there any supplement that maybe we didn't go over that you either think is important that we didn't hit on, and or that is on the rise that maybe it's not as popular right now, but you feel like there's some research that's picking up on it or something like that, or maybe there isn't one?
Sure. Yeah. I'll try and squeeze a few things into one answer. Jeff, I know that you were interested in speaking about supplements for the gut. Yep. Prebiotics, probiotics. There's also now this supplement category of postbiotics, which are these metabolites and minerals and vitamins that are produced by gut bacteria that in turn have some health promoting effects. And into this category go things like certain short chain fatty acids. And some people are taking these as supplements, and I think some of them might have some potential. But were I to try and summarize my perspective on those briefly, I would just say that consuming a wide range of different whole food products and plants specifically is generally good for gut health. So within the constraints of whatever diet you're on, that could be a ketogenic diet, it could be a low FODMAP diet. Trying to increase your diet diversity is good for your gut health. And there are lots of different so-called prebiotic substances that are out there. They're not just fibers. When people think about prebiotics, they often think about fructose or inulin or psyllium or any of these types of products. But there are also things like polyphenols, these chemicals in plants that seem to have some prebiotic effects. So consume a diversity of different plants, and there are really easy ways to do that. If you're buying almonds at the grocery store, buy mixed nuts instead. If you're buying basil, buy mixed herbs instead. If you're buying kidney beans, buy mixed beans instead. You understand where I'm coming from. And that's a really easy win. There was a really interesting study by Christopher Gardner and some of his colleagues not that long ago, where they compared people consuming a high fiber diet to a diet that was supplemented with live food, so things like yogurt and kefir. And they found that the live food group had the greatest increase in the diversity of the gut over time. And so I think adding some fermented foods into your diet on a regular basis, certainly consuming these several times a week, is a good way to go. And a really easy way to do that is just, if you like yogurt, just consume some yogurt that contains active cultures in it. But you can also use things like kefir, sauerkraut. You can make your own of those products if you like to. I don't think you need to go the probiotic route, which isn't to say that specific probiotics can't be helpful, because I think they definitely can. And some of these have been relatively well studied, like Lactobacillus plantarum has been studied in the context of people experiencing lots of stress. But we need to get to the point where we can actually prescribe these on a personalized basis. And I just don't think we actually understand enough about gut function to be able to do that just yet. And so while the guidance is generic, I think diversity of plant foods, consuming live foods on a regular basis, obviously removing things that irritate the gut, which for some people will include things like spicy foods, is a good way to go. And then finally, let's say that you're going through a phase in which your fiber intake is a lot lower than it is normally. Maybe you're going traveling, like we spoke about in the context of taking a multivitamin. You could take a fiber supplement with you then. Just take some powdered inulin with you or some powdered psyllium and take 10 grams a day, split into 2 doses. So that's supplements for gut health, or just a nutritional approach to gut health in general. Another one that I'll mention is people experiencing a cough or a cold, just because this is really common.
Yep.
And there are actually things that you can do to get over it faster. My favorite of these is, I think, probably the best research, but it's taking zinc acetate lozenges. And it needs to be zinc acetate. You want to take probably something like 80 milligrams of elemental zinc per day. And you often get these in lozenges that each contain roughly 10 milligrams. So you might take 8 lozenges over the course of your waking day, and you just let them sit on the inside of your cheek and dissolve in your mouth. And they just slowly release zinc into that area, and they seem to inhibit viral replication when people do this at the onset of cold symptoms. So as soon as you think I'm coming down with a cough, you've got to be able to scratch your throat, say, take this approach. And on average, people shorten their cold duration by about 3 days on average, looking at meta-analyses, and they also slightly reduce the severity of their symptoms. So I'd add that. And then otherwise, we could go into all sorts of different products for different bodily systems, but I will mention a couple of categories. So one is products to support brain health, because a lot of people, I think, are interested in being smarter. And there's this interesting overlap between people who are avid exercisers and people who are hard charging knowledge workers too. And I think a lot of the picks out there aren't great, but there are a few that have actually been quite well studied. And at the top of that list are things like Bacopa monnieri, which is typically 300 milligrams, 50% bacicides. There's a product named Keen Mind that has been quite well researched, seems to be good for certain aspects of cognition. Another is citicoline. I think the dose that you probably want to take is something like 500 milligrams per day. Doses as high as about 2 grams have been studied. But if you're consuming enough dietary choline, you probably don't need to worry about it too much. So just increasing your intake of things like eggs will probably get you to a similar position. You probably don't need to supplement it. But if you don't like eggs and you don't consume enough choline, and that can also have some effects on things like your liver health, then taking citicoline, I think, is a fine option. And then otherwise, cocoa products are great for cardiovascular health, and then unsurprisingly great for brain health too. Obviously, your ability to deliver blood and thereby oxygen and glucose and so on to your brain is really important to brain function. And certain cocoa products that are rich in flavonols, and there are some of these that are standardized for their flavanol content. For example, there's a product in the US named Cocoa Via that's available either as capsules or as a powder. And I think the capsules contain something like 500 milligrams of flavanols, and the dose that you want, depending on the effects that you're after, is probably somewhere between 500 milligrams and 1 gram of flavanols per day. It's really good for cardiovascular health. There's interesting work showing that regular cocoa intake does actually reduce cardiovascular mortality, and it seems to do so by reducing blood pressure and improving some other aspects of cardiovascular health, such as endothelial function. So regular cocoa intake, you could take that supplement. There are also some good dark chocolate products out there. The issue with those is that some of them are quite high in cadmium in particular, and some of them are quite high in lead too, depending on the soil conditions. And as a rule of thumb, products that come from Latin America tend to be higher in those heavy metals than products from Africa, and that's just because of soil conditions. Go for dark chocolate products from Africa, even if they're not considered the finest products. Go for products that are rich in cocoa. There is actually a brand over here, it's based in Brighton in the UK, called Montezuma's, that's monstrously high in flavanols and very low in heavy metals. It's also very high in caffeine, unsurprisingly. I think the bar contains something like 330 milligrams of caffeine. But suffice it to say, you can consume it by way of dark chocolate. The darker, the better. Just look into whether there's any information about flavanol content and heavy metal content, and you want more flavanols and fewer heavy metals. And then the other category that I'll just briefly mention is that anti-aging one that we just touched on earlier, discussing glycine and NAC. And there's so much interest in this subject now. There's this sort of transition in, at the moment, everyone seems to want to live forever, which is intriguing. all the billionaires are getting their blood transfusions and they're doing their stem cell therapies and they're taking their NR and their NMN and all these different things, hoping to add some years to their lives. But of these different anti-aging supplements, I think a few of them are actually really interesting. I don't think that many of them are ready for prime time just yet. But in addition to glycine plus NAC, I think the ones that have some okay clinical evidence behind them include Mitopure, which is actually a postbiotic that's been shown to improve some aspects of physical performance in older adults, but it's painfully expensive to the point where I wouldn't recommend it even to rich people. And the size of the effects isn't particularly impressive. Another is spermidine, which is so named because it was first discovered in sperm. It's a polyamine and it seems to act in a few different ways, but one of them is by increasing autophagy, which is this kind of housekeeping function in which cells clear themselves of debris that would otherwise render them less functional. And the dose that's used in studies is about 1 or 2 milligrams of spermidine per day. And there are some products that are used in research that are available to consumers, such as Primidine is one of them, and Spermidine Life is another one. But the interesting thing about these is that spermidine is found in loads of foods. It's particularly concentrated in wheat germ. So you could just buy some wheat germ powder and stick it on your oats in the morning if you want to get some of these benefits potentially. Obviously, you don't know what dose you're getting, but that probably will increase your spermidine intake without the need for expensive supplements. And then there are a couple, I'll mention 3 more. One of them, which is really interesting, but we need to know a lot more about it, is lithium, which is found in the water. And when people hear lithium, they think, oh, that's like medication that's used as an antipsychotic. It's used for people who have bipolar disorder and some other mental health troubles. And that's true. But there are 2 lines of evidence that make me really curious about it. One of them is that there's a dose-response relationship between concentrations of lithium in tap water and how long people live. And the other is that there's been some work recently by Michael Risto, in particular, comparing how long people live when they take lithium compared to other antipsychotic medications. And they did this analysis at the UK Biobank this year. And basically people who were taking lithium lived substantially longer than the other people. And so there's a signal there, and I'm sure there is something to it. The issue with lithium, though, is that more is not better. I mentioned dose response earlier. It's not a linear dose response relationship. And I think there's probably a sweet spot at which you want to maintain your body levels of lithium. But my guess is that regular low dose lithium supplementation is probably good for mood, but also many other aspects of health and various different bodily systems. Another one that I'll mention is taurine. People think about that in the context of energy drinks like Red Bull and some others, but taurine levels decline with age. And there was this high profile publication that just came out in Science showing that to be the case, but then also showing that when you replete bodily taurine levels as animals age, they basically have a longer health span. And also going back to those hallmarks of aging, many of those are improved in response to the taurine intake. And one of the reasons that I'm curious about this is that the dose of taurine that would be needed to mimic this in humans isn't particularly high. It's 3 to 6 grams a day, which is more or less in line with recommendations by various different bodies around the world. They tend to say that doses of 3 grams a day are absolutely fine for people. And taurine's an inexpensive amino acid. So that's intriguing. And I think that there might be real potential there for people above a certain age. And then finally, the category of Senolytics. you could speak about xenomorphics too, but Senolytics in particular is really interesting. And the idea behind this is that as we age, and also as various different tissues lose their function, so take the example of somebody who has arthritis, you see this accumulation of senescent cells in those areas. And basically there's this irreversible state of cell cycle arrest in these tissues. And as a result of that, they accumulate over time, and they also release various different inflammatory factors into the local environment that then impair the function of nearby cells. And that contributes to pathology when it continues. And what Senolytics do is they basically go into these tissues and they selectively target these senescent cells, removing them. And so because of this particular mechanism, Senolytics don't need to be taken every day. And instead, they're dosed intermittently. And the research that's been done on this so far has tended to use quercetin and dasatinib, which is a cancer medication, although going by preclinical research, it seems that there are probably some ways of getting similar effects to dasatinib by way of dietary supplements, such as curcumin and piperlongumine. But the dose of quercetin that's used isn't particularly high. It's about 1 gram of quercetin phytosome per day. You can get that from companies like Thorne. And the dose of curcumin that would be needed, I don't think is that high either. And you would just basically take that for 3 consecutive days and then repeat that a month later. And you might go through a few cycles of that once you're past a certain age. And that way you're clearing these senescent cells out of certain tissues and thereby potentially prolonging your health span, possibly lifespan too. And the most potent of these senolytics that's been identified to date is fisetin, which is a polyphenol that's found in foods such as strawberries. And preclinical research on rodents is really impressive, and they're just starting to do clinical trials on this at the moment. But the way they're dosing that is 20 milligrams per kilogram per day for 2 consecutive days, and then repeating that for 5 cycles of 2 days per month, and seeing how people fare when they do that. And I'm really eager to see those results because I think they'll be promising based on the work that's been done so far. But again, while I've mentioned dosing things, this isn't something I'd recommend yet. There's the small potential for a downside in young people, just because if cells senesce, they go into this age state. There are reasons for that. And one potential problem is that if you clear these senescent cells, some people speculate that you might be disposing yourself to developing cancer, because those senescent cells might actually halt the progression of tumors. So we'll have to wait and see. And I think the real risk of that is actually probably quite low, but it does give me a little bit of pause. It's not something that I'd recommend just yet, but yeah, looking forward to the results of those data. So very long answer there, Jeff. Covered quite a lot of ground, but there are some really interesting ones out there, and I'm quite excited about a few of them. And I haven't really put them into the context of the types of things that a lot of people tuning into this will be looking for at the moment. But suffice it to say that I think that some of those are very relevant to things like resistance training. For example, as you do resistance training, we know that various different mechanical forces, things like shear forces, they do cause some cells to senesce locally. So you do, for example, see the accumulation of senescent cells in tissues that are heavily loaded by resistance training. And that's one of the reasons why lots of us will end up with arthritic knees and hips over time. And so I think that for people like yourself, Jeff, who are going to the gym, lifting heavy weights, some of these senescent or some of these senolytic agents that selectively target certain tissues, because they don't just target everywhere all at once. It's likely that this one's good for the brain and this one's good for the joints and this one's good for the liver, might be really beneficial, and you might be able to use it in a precision way that helps address the particular tissue pathology that you're experiencing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Super interesting stuff. And like you said, it could be helpful for somebody that's resistance training at some point, because I feel like that probably is a big issue with people who resistance train as they get older, joint issue and stuff like that. Cool, Greg. Appreciate your time. We went a little over on time, but we knew we had to get all these supplements in today. Appreciate you going over these for the last 3 episodes. There's a ton of great information here. Like I said, I suggest people go back and look at those other episodes as well too. But yeah, before I let you go, is there anywhere where you'd like to lead the audience to? I know your podcast just came out as well too. Yeah, I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, as you say, podcast is now out. It's Reason and Wellbeing, and it's available through all your usual podcast platforms, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and so on. There's also the YouTube channel, which is at Greg Potter PhD, so youtube.com/at Greg Potter PhD, where you can find it. But yeah, I'd love it if people tune in and let me know what they think. I've had some really good feedback on it so far, and I'm really enjoying the process of interviewing people and finding out more about various different subjects. It's forcing me to learn about lots of different things, which is always fun.
Yeah, no, it really is. And not only do you get to build a relationship with somebody, but you also get to learn a lot along the way too, and make some connections. So I agree. It's fun, and it's always fun interviewing other people. So great. Again, appreciate your time, man. Like I said, a ton of great information in these last 3 episodes, and we'll obviously have you on again in the future to chat about something else that we find interesting at some point too. We'll talk to you soon, Greg.
Thanks, Jeff.